There are more guns than people in the United States, over 400 million firearms, in a country of about 330 million. The Second Amendment, just one sentence long, has fueled centuries of debate, countless court cases, and fierce political battles. But what does it actually say about the right to bear arms? To really understand what the Second Amendment means, we need to go back to the early days of the United States. Right after the Revolutionary War, the country was still figuring out how to govern itself. The American colonists had just fought a war to free themselves from British rule, and they were very aware of the dangers of a powerful central government. One of their biggest fears? A standing army. A standing army is a full-time, professional military force controlled by the national government. The colonists had seen firsthand how the British Army was used to enforce oppressive laws, and they didn't want the same thing to happen in their newly independent country. Many Americans believed that if the government had a permanent army, it could use it to suppress its own people. So, instead of relying on a federal military force, they preferred state militias, groups of ordinary citizens who could take up arms when needed. These militias were a big part of life in early America. People weren't just allowed to own guns, they were expected to. Guns were necessary for hunting, self-defense, and even community protection. In many places, able-bodied men were required to be part of the local militia and to have their own weapons ready in case of an emergency. This wasn't just about personal safety. It was about making sure the country could defend itself without depending on a powerful, government-controlled army.
Then these terrible problems would only get worse. Look, if you do want to blame someone other than the shooter himself, maybe turn your attention to 8chan, an internet message board.
But not everyone agreed on how the new country's military should work. This debate became a major issue between two political groups: the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists, led by people like Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, wanted a strong central government. They argued that the country needed a professional army to defend against foreign threats and maintain order. After all, the Revolutionary War had shown how difficult it was to organize militias and fight a trained military force. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, were deeply suspicious of government power. Leaders like Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry feared that a standing army could be used to oppress the people, just as the British had done. They believed that the best way to protect freedom was to keep military power in the hands of state militias, made up of ordinary citizens. They saw militias as the ultimate safeguard against tyranny. This debate wasn't just theoretical, it had real consequences. The Constitution, as originally written, allowed the federal government to raise an army. But many anti-federalists worried that this would lead to a repeat of British oppression. To ease these fears and gain support for the new Constitution, James Madison drafted the Bill of Rights, which included the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment was a compromise. It allowed the federal government to have an army, but also guaranteed that the people would always have the right to bear arms. At the time, this right wasn't mainly about individual self-defense. It was about making sure citizens could be part of a militia. The idea was that if the government ever became tyrannical, the people could take up arms to resist it. In recent years, the United States has witnessed numerous tragic school shootings, leading to renewed debates over the Second Amendment and gun control. For instance, in September 2024, a shooting at Appalachia High School in Georgia resulted in 4 deaths and 9 injuries, making it the deadliest school shooting that year. Such incidents often reignite discussions about the balance between individual gun rights and public safety, with many advocating for stricter gun control measures to prevent future tragedies. Of course, things have changed a lot since then. The U.S. now has one of the most powerful military forces in the world, and state militias are no longer the country's main defense. But the Second Amendment is still one of the most hotly debated parts of the Constitution, and a lot of that debate comes down to how we interpret it. Over the years, there have been 2 main ways of interpreting the Second Amendment. One focuses on the first part of the amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, while the other focuses on the second part, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The way you interpret these words makes a huge difference in what you think the Second Amendment actually means. The first interpretation is known as the collective rights view. People who believe in this interpretation argue that the right to bear arms is tied directly to the idea of a militia. In other words, they believe that the Second Amendment was never meant to guarantee an unrestricted right to own guns. Instead, it was meant to make sure that states could maintain their own militias, separate from the federal army.
And dumped by their provider, Voxility. This is going to continue for a while, John, but they'll be online soon enough. If Nazi site The Daily Stormer got back online, 8chan will. But in the meantime, be thankful for small mercies.
Supporters of this view point out that in the 18th century, militias were made up of ordinary citizens who kept weapons at home so they could be ready if called upon. The well-regulated part of the amendment suggests that these militias were supposed to be organized and trained, not just a random group of gun owners. So, under this interpretation, the Second Amendment protects the right to bear arms only in the context of a militia, not as an unlimited individual right. For most of American history, this was the dominant legal interpretation. Courts generally ruled that gun ownership was tied to military service, not personal self-defense. That's why, for a long time, laws restricting gun ownership weren't considered unconstitutional. Then, there's the second interpretation, the individual rights view. People who support this interpretation argue that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to own and carry firearms, regardless of militia service. They focus on the phrase, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, arguing that the people means individuals, just like it does in other parts of the Bill of Rights. This interpretation started gaining popularity in the late 20th century, especially with the rise of gun rights advocacy groups like the National Rifle Association, NRA. Supporters argue that the founders understood the right to bear arms as a fundamental part of personal freedom and self-defense. They also point out that even in colonial times, people used guns for protection, hunting, and other personal reasons, not just militia duty. The individual rights interpretation was solidified in 2008, when the Supreme Court made a landmark ruling in the case of District of Columbia versus Heller. In this case, a Washington, D.C. law banned handguns, and a man named Dick Heller challenged it, arguing that it violated his Second Amendment rights. The Supreme Court agreed with him. In a 5-4 decision, the court ruled that the Second Amendment does protect an individual's right to own firearms for self-defense, not just in the context of a militia. This ruling was a huge turning point. It was the first time the Supreme Court explicitly stated that the Second Amendment protects individual gun ownership. However, the court also said that this right isn't unlimited. Governments can still pass laws restricting certain types of weapons or preventing certain people, like felons, from owning guns. So, which interpretation is correct? That depends on who you ask. The collective rights interpretation is more in line with how the Second Amendment was originally understood in the 18th century. But the individual rights interpretation reflects how many Americans view gun ownership today. The debate over gun rights isn't just about history. It's about how we balance individual freedom with public safety in the modern world.
The high-capacity magazine capable of holding up to 250 bullets. In 30 seconds, he killed 9 people and wounded 27 others before being killed by police.
Over the years, several major cases have shaped how we interpret the right to bear arms. Some rulings reinforced the idea that gun ownership was tied to militias, while others expanded the right to individual gun ownership. Back in 1939, the Supreme Court heard a case called United States versus Miller. This case challenged a law called the National Firearms Act, NFA, which put restrictions on certain types of firearms, including sawed-off shotguns. The law required people to register and pay a tax on certain weapons, and it was designed to cut down on organized crime violence. 2 men, Jack Miller and Frank Layton, were arrested for carrying an unregistered sawed-off shotgun across state lines. They argued that the NFA violated their Second Amendment rights. When the case made it to the Supreme Court, the justices ruled against Miller and Layton. The court decided that the Second Amendment didn't protect the right to own weapons that had no clear connection to maintaining a militia. In other words, if a gun wasn't something that a well-regulated militia would typically use, then it wasn't necessarily protected by the Second Amendment. This ruling supported the idea that gun ownership was tied to service in a militia, rather than an unlimited personal right to own any kind of firearm. For a long time, the Miller decision set the tone for how courts interpreted the Second Amendment. It reinforced the collective rights view, the idea that the right to bear arms was linked to militias, not individual gun ownership. But decades later, a different case would challenge that understanding completely. Fast forward to 2008, when the Supreme Court heard a case called District of Columbia versus Heller. This case was a game changer. At the time, Washington, D.C. had a strict handgun ban, which made it almost impossible for residents to legally own one. A man named Dick Heller, a security guard in D.C., wanted to keep a handgun in his home for self-defense, but the city's laws wouldn't allow it. So he took the case to court, arguing that the ban violated his Second Amendment rights. When the Supreme Court ruled on the case, it was a huge moment for gun rights advocates. The court ruled in favor of Heller, deciding that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to own a firearm for personal use, including self-defense in the home. This was a major shift from the Miller ruling, which had tied gun ownership to militias. Now, the Supreme Court was saying that the Second Amendment applies to individuals, not just organized groups. Justice Antonin Scalia, who wrote the majority opinion, made it clear that the Second Amendment protects the right of regular people, not just militia members, to own guns. However, he also pointed out that the right isn't unlimited. The government could still regulate certain types of weapons and restrict who can own them. For example, laws preventing felons or the mentally ill from owning guns were still considered constitutional. The Heller decision was a turning point because it established that the Second Amendment protects personal gun ownership. But there was still one major question left unanswered. Did this ruling only apply to the federal government, or did it also apply to state and local governments? That question was answered 2 years later in another important case, McDonald versus City of Chicago. At the time, Chicago had a handgun ban similar to the one in D.C. A man named Otis McDonald wanted to keep a gun in his home for self-defense, but the city's laws wouldn't allow it. So he challenged the law, arguing that the ruling in Heller should apply to states as well. When the case reached the Supreme Court, the justices ruled in favor of McDonald. They decided that the Second Amendment applies not just at the federal level, but also at the state and local levels. This meant that states and cities couldn't pass laws that completely banned handgun ownership, because that would violate the individual right recognized in Heller. With these two cases, the Supreme Court had dramatically changed how the Second Amendment was interpreted. For most of American history, gun rights were seen as something tied to militias. But after Heller and McDonald, the court made it clear that the right to bear arms is an individual right that applies across the country. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.